Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure for me to be here. Many thanks to Mr. S.S. Teo and Mr. Ho Ming Kit for having me here today and also part of this entire process as a member of one of the focus groups as well. Now, I'm a little bit stressed. Originally, we were allocated 40 minutes for this discussion, which is something that I suspect will not be quite enough. Even worse, I'm coming just before the tea break. And of course, holding up a large audience like this before the tea break can be a very stressful situation for the moderator. And even worse, we are slightly overrunning now as well. So I'm going to eat a little bit into your tea break time. I'm very glad that everybody had a chance to say hi to each other because you will now have 20 minutes less of tea break time to chat later. Nizam, and I'm going to steal this joke from earlier. He was just saying that when you invite 5 economists into a room, you'll end up with 6 perspectives for the future. We're very fortunate that we only have 4 economists today, so hopefully we'll see how we go. But we have 4 very preeminent and illustrious economists on stage here today. Now, the format is I'm going to invite each of them to share very briefly, perhaps about 5 or 6 minutes, their thoughts for the economic outlook for this present year and also for the medium-term future. And hopefully we'll be able to take about 20 minutes worth of Q&A. And as you can see on Pigeonhole, we have already got a bunch of questions and some of them getting very high votes as well. So without further ado, I'd like to start with the sole lady on stage first, Selena, to kick us off with your outlook for this year and the medium term. Selena, please.
Okay. Hi. Okay, I would like to characterize 2015 as a year of lows. Okay, we had low interest rates, low volatility, and low growth. Okay, and 2016 looks like it's going to be slightly different. Okay, but the one thing that will stay the same is you're still going to have low growth. But on the flip side, you have higher volatility and higher interest rates to come. So it is going to be very challenging for corporates. Okay? I think if you look at the world today, in the past, people always say when US sneezes, Asia catches a cold. Today, China is really the tail that wags the dog. When Chinese equity markets sell off, the rest of the global equity markets respond. I think the concern about China can be double-edged. Okay? If we are dependent on China as a consumer, obviously their slowdown and rebalancing story has great implications. Even if we are not dependent on China, the fact is when China rebalances, there's a lot of fallout within the region. I think the biggest issue facing us today is one of greater volatility in the markets, hedging in particular. Even if you are SME and you would like to go overseas to invest, you may have a profit margin that's in the double digit. But if you look at the currency volatility that has been taking place over the last 6 months, your profits can actually be very squeezed just by currency alone. So that's not even factoring in other risks, like such as interest rate risk. So I think it is a challenging time. I wouldn't say that I'm all bearish, because I think there are some opportunities out there. I mean, on one side, basically all prices are low, so your utility cost is low, transport cost is low. Secondly, as I think the earlier survey did show, there are markets that are still growing, the CLMV markets, Myanmar, Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, they are still seeing about 6 to 8% growth, although you have to be fairly brave. The main caveat here is that there is growth, and you can hedge for interest rates, you can hedge for FX, but it's a different story altogether when you're talking about political risks or unclear regimes or rules that change. Okay? I think the third upside really is that actually there are some positive initiatives that are coming out from the slow growth environment. Okay, the AEC, the ASEAN Economic Community, being one. Secondly, you also have the TPP. I think in response to China's initiatives, we have seen a lot of progress being done for the TPP, and now you have Indonesia saying they want in on the TPP. And of course, you also have China's One Belt, One Road. So actually, there are markets out there that's growing, there are business opportunities. It's just that financial markets are in a bit of a mayhem. I think if you look domestically as well, Singapore firms really face 3 challenges. First one is the big C, cost. Okay, manpower cost is high, rental cost is high, and of course, the last C is competitiveness. Okay, can we be the cheapest? If we cannot be the cheapest, can we be the fastest to market? If we cannot be the fastest to market, are we the ones that is disrupting technologies in established industries like Uber and the rest? If we are not, then what's our value add? Okay. I think we have to see the SMEs really moving away from a subcontractor type of mentality. So it's good to see a lot of government initiatives trying to breed home capabilities. Okay? I think the other good point really is that if you look at the Singapore model, we're starting from a fairly strong starting position, meaning that actually fiscal reserves are strong. And you know, there are not that many governments today that have the wherewithal to actually put down 19 billion to invest in R&D. So I do think that there is a lot of potential for a far-sighted government if they do continue to invest in the economic infrastructure and growing the local pie. Okay? So although we have a very challenging times ahead, but I would say I'm hopeful, okay? I wouldn't say I'm bearish totally.
Thanks very much. Let's turn now to Waiho to share some of his views for the future. I think we might have to share the mics.
Thank you, Nick and Selena. I think I will echo a large number of points made by Selena. When I came back from holiday, brief family holiday in Bali, I was wishing to myself that it's 2016 and I'm looking forward to better indicators, you know, from emerging markets, from developed markets. But sad to say, when I came back to work, the first thing I saw was Korea's export numbers for December. And what was striking about December was that it was the worst print of the whole year in 2015. So for Korea, a large manufacturing economy, it says a lot about the state of external demand. It's not turning around as we had hoped for in the Q1 of 2016, but rather it seems to be getting slightly worse. So I would echo that sentiment that was flashed by Lincoln earlier that you did. So in a nutshell, the manufacturing recession that started with China's structural reforms is still progressing quite strongly. China, in a nutshell, there are two things. First, China is becoming more self-sufficient, which means it's reducing its import demand at precisely the wrong time, and when world demand is actually quite fragile. Second, it is also trying to engineer the right level in its exchange rate, and that's causing some undue volatility in currency markets, and which also destroys import demand because firms in China defer production decisions when the outlook is, especially for financial variables, is a little bit more uncertain. So this has perpetuated what we've seen as the manufacturing recession, which started sometime in Q3 last year. Very evident in our NODX numbers in Singapore, but it's by no means limited to Singapore. It is shared across the region, particularly the trade-dependent economies of Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore, and also China. So exports have been down because of this manufacturing recession. But unfortunately, going into 2016, we've yet to find the bottom yet. But we will get there sometime towards the middle of the year, one hopes. What was different about my call last year and this year is that I pushed the forecast for the bottom for exports for Asia out to June this year. Earlier on, we were hoping that Q1 would show us that bottom, but apparently relief is not in sight yet. But the silver lining here is that with apparently more stress being put on policymakers across the region, there's greater hope for more accommodation, lower interest rates. A number of economies recently, like Taiwan, for example, the most conservative central bank in Asia, decided to cut rates the same day the Fed raised rates. So the signal sent was very important. We can be different. We can go the opposite direction. Circumstances here are a little bit unique, but we're willing to accommodate, find intelligent solutions for our unique paradigms in Asia. What can Singapore do in this environment? Well, if you can't control external demand, you can't control sales and revenue outlook. But what you can control is on the cost side, like what Selena mentioned, and also that very brilliant chapter that's given in the SBF's position paper. I think cost review committee, like we've done in the past, can probably be very timely for now, for the first half of this year. Let's get into that early and see what we can save in terms of cost to preserve the bottom line as we navigate towards the bottom in terms of revenue. So I'll just stop my remarks here.
Thanks much. Nizam, over to you.
Thank you, sir. Well, our two colleagues have basically given a rather broad view and then trying to narrow it down to Singapore. What I'll try to do is probably start with a few questions and then end with a few observations. Do you know that actually Singapore has been rated, according to a few research papers, in particular from the Economic Intelligence Unit as well as from INSEAD, to be one of the countries that is least creative in the world. We are least creative than countries like Cambodia, Burkina Faso, for example. So that is an important observation in my view. I think we need to think about that. Now, the second observation is, Singapore's economy, if you look, in a cross-section of growth engines, the Singapore's economy has not changed very much over the last 10 years. So there have been some changes here and there, but the main driver has still been, for SMEs to support MNCs and for, export-driven sector to drive the economy, both in electronics as well as biomedical. That hasn't changed significantly, and I think that needs to be worked on as well. Now, the third observation I make is that, I think Waiho mentioned this as well, but 2015 was the first time since the WTO in 1990 that global trade actually shrunk when the global economy is not in recession. Since 1990, actually global trade has been something like a growth driven by steroids, right? Global growth grow at 3%, you get trade growing at 9%. And that's really good for emerging markets and exporters like Singapore. But that is no longer the case. In fact, last year global growth was 2.6%, 2.7%. Total trade in volume terms actually contracted. Right? This is a stunning revelation in my view, because we have never seen that before. So now with these three observations, what kind of views can I highlight as we look into 2016 and beyond? Right? For me, I think the root of the situation that I just spoke about is really global growth has been driven by a different engine lately. It is not consumption. It is not your typical trade activities. It is actually driven by creativity, right? You look at China, the manufacturing sector is in recession, but the economy is still growing decently, and that's really because the creative sector, the internet sector, the new economy sector is still doing well. So I think we need to be mindful of that. Now, if you look at China's manufacturing sector, this is the second observation, second view really. If you look at China's manufacturing sector and export sector, they are in recession. Waiho alluded to that. Now, how do we compete with them? How do we even envisage growing when an economy with very low cost is suffering, right? So basically, in my view, cost is not the long-term solution. Cost is a cushion, but I think the long-term solution has to be from elsewhere. And my final observation and view is that I think we have to be mindful as well that we cannot achieve growth of 5% average that we have seen pre-global financial crisis. In fact, we should be talking about 2.5 to 3.5% global growth as the new normal. And for Singapore, I think it will then mean growth of a slightly more modest estimate of 2%. Or thereabout. So if you take everything into consideration, therefore, I think it is not going to be easy, obviously. We are not positioned, in my humble opinion, for the kind of growth that the global economy is seeing right now, and that is in the creative sector. And cost can only be a cushion, but not the long-term solution, while at the same time, I think we need to be mindful that global growth and indeed domestic growth will not go back to the kind of levels that we saw pre-global financial crisis. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Nizam. Perhaps now I'll ask Irvin to wrap us up for the first part of this panel.
Okay, so it's a challenge, to speak after three very prominent economies. I mean, how do you going to value on that, add on that? Well, I would like to look at things more from, short-term, cyclical, and longer-term structural perspective, particularly pertaining to Singapore economy. Now, in the near term, what Selena and Waiho has already touched on, essentially, I would like to put it very briefly. In 2014, end of 2014, when we came up with the theme for 2015, which is last year, essentially I look at 2015 as, for Singapore, as small boat in rough seas. That was the theme. And in the end, it turned out that 2015 was a volatile year. 2016, it is essentially what I would like to describe it as winter before spring. Now the question is this: is it going to be a long winter? And how cold will the winter be? That's the crux of the issue. Of course, every year for the past few years, I noticed also in the market, analysts, many of us, we are equally guilty of that. We look into the next year with hope, with optimism, and say that next year will be better, and then only to push back our view in the first half of the year. Well, I'm not trying to repeat this mistake, but the thing is that the environment is challenging, but there are some, hope as long as we do the right thing today. Now, this also brings me to the second part, which is on structural basis. Now, if you want to look in the medium term, I think Singapore is definitely in the transition phase. The past 50 years have been glamorous. We have strong economic prosperity and development. Going forward, it will be very challenging because the issue facing the economy will be very complex. First and foremost, I do not want to dwell too much into the global geopolitical issues, but domestically, for sure, everyone knows population is aging. Essentially, the focus of macroeconomic policy going forward will be one which will shift, it will shift from one that is pretty much on building resilience in the economy to staying relevant. The world has changed so much. Creative technology have changed the way businesses functions, the way we communicate. In fact, it changed our life totally. And then Nizam has rightfully pointed out, the structure of the Singapore economy haven't changed much. Then in other countries, they are doing much, much faster than us. In China, in India, e-commerce, Internet of Things are becoming a way of life. And here in Singapore, we are still struggling to keep pace. The world is changing very fast. If we don't do something today, I'm afraid that this winter I'm talking about is going to last for a long while. So I think it's a great effort, commendable effort, that the SBF, together with all the trade associations, that come together to issue this position paper. For the first time, all the business bodies, have spoken in one single voice, highlighting their concerns. And one of the key things that has been highlighted again and again is cost. But seriously, cost is just a buffer. It's a short-term solution. In the longer term, it's about how we grow the economy, how we can we continue to sustain the economic prosperity that has actually benefited all of us, all Singaporeans for the past 50 years. So how can you grow? I think some of the things could be shared later on, but I have issued a paper last year. One way to grow, in fact, one way to restructure the economy, it's not about cost cutting, it's not about reducing your headcount. Ironically, the way to survive, the way to sustain our economic development going forward is to continue to grow. And how do we grow that? How do we continue to grow? First, we have to create that value, which will set us apart from our competitors. And secondly, we have to grow out of Singapore. I believe all of us should know by now. The issue is how to get there. And this is where I think the government plays an important role as a facilitator. But at the end of the day, it all boils down to what do we want to do as individuals today. The business at the end of the day is not driven by the government. The business is driven by all of us. So it really depends on what we do today in order to ride through this winter. This winter could be a short one. It could only last for perhaps a few quarters, but it could also last for a few years. Much really depends on what we do today.
Thanks very much, Irvin, and thanks very much to all the panelists for really touching on a broad range of issues that span both macro, global type issues to specific micro issues that face Singapore and Singapore companies currently and possibly over the next few years as well. As you can see, there are quite a few questions, getting quite a lot of votes on Pigeonhole as well. I'll come to that very shortly, but I will use the moderator's privilege to pose a question to the panel and to anyone who feels they want to answer this. Now, this is in reference to a specific recommendation in the SBF position paper, which is that the government should seek to help local companies expand overseas, essentially broadening the market that local companies have access to beyond the geographical borders of Singapore itself. Now, given what we've spoken about, and everyone here has shared about the year ahead, the global environment, as well as the conditions and challenging and otherwise that are facing the global economy, do you think this is something that we should push ahead in the immediate term in 2016, or is this something that we should potentially wait and see for a couple of years? Does anybody like to share a thought on that? Irvin first.
Well, obviously the government has a role to play. At the end of the day, the government is a facilitator, essentially in terms of its policy mechanisms, putting out the right policy, ensuring and also to help build a conducive environment for businesses to thrive. Now, Selena has touched on just now about, that with the implementation of the TPP, the signing of the TPP, and also the implementation of AEC. Now, these are essentially areas where the government can play a role, as well as some of the domestic policies. In the past years, we have seen basically introduction of a whole slew of policy measures to restructure the economy. It includes those painful initiatives, such as tightening in foreign labor policy, as well as the more appealing, palatable policies such as the PIC. Now, beyond that, we talk about, the way to drive growth, creativity, innovation, create values. Now, sometimes we also have to ask ourselves, what are the limitations from policymakers' perspective in terms of that? How can we use policy to create creativity? We can use policy to help to foster an environment for creativity to thrive. But then again, at the end of the day, it really depends on the mindset of Singaporeans as well. It may even extend to areas such as our education policies. For example, we often hear, complaints on the ground saying that, parents essentially are more interested in acing their kids' exam rather than, trying to appreciate the kind of knowledge that have been taught to the students. So how can we create that kind of a creative thinking, the out-of-the-box kind of thinking, which will eventually brings about more innovations in the longer term? It all boils down to mindsets of Singaporeans. And this is something which I think as policymakers, they have to consider as well. How can we shift the mindset of Singaporeans into always questioning the conventional wisdom? Singaporean students are well known in terms of international maths Olympic exams, so on and so forth. We often ace, and score very well. But the thing is that going forward, how can we often challenge the conventional wisdom and think of solutions to real-life problems? Recently, I've met someone from India. We are talking about Internet of Things. He said that it's difficult to encourage, promote the growth of Internet of Things in Singapore. I asked him why. He said because you guys are faced with so little problem. You are in a comfort zone. You are not pushed to the limit to think out of the box. In India, in China, they are faced with real problems on a day-to-day basis, and it's those problems that drives the solutions. It compels people to think out of the box, question the conventional norm, conventional wisdom. And then it gave rise to innovative solutions. Of course, I'm not saying that we should make our environment here more, harsher or more difficult. But the thing is that we should create the kind of system that will shape Singaporeans' mindset into that area. I guess this is the area where policy may have to focus, rather than giving X dollars incentive until 2018, and then hoping that this will bring about more productivity or innovation. So we need to look deeper in terms of policy decision going forward. Those TPP, AEC, those things are essentially just platform, basically to give certainties to businesses when they venture overseas. Beyond that, how can you create the kind of comparative advantage? This is where I believe innovation, creativity, and mindset shift will be very crucial.
Nizam, did you have something to add on to that?
Yeah, just some observation. I guess TPPs and all sorts of multilateral trade deals are useful, but I think based on all sorts of research papers, really these things are most impactful for countries without already present bilateral deals. So for Singapore, we already have deals with everyone. Apart from Mars, maybe, I don't know. But really, I think, point is, I think while they are useful, I don't think we should pay too much attention to them as would countries like Vietnam. You know, it'll be very, very impactful for Vietnam, impactful for Singapore to a certain degree. Now, insofar as mindsets are concerned, you know, it takes me back to that creativity survey or research paper that was done. Really, this is a simple research. They base it on number of patents, you know, each country have actually produced, and then, you know, they divide that by the inputs. By inputs, I mean, you know, IT services, infrastructures, education, you know, labor force level of education and so on. We have the lowest in that. And so the question is why? For me, the mindset question really goes back to not just the individuals that Irvin just mentioned, but I think also the government. At the risk of being nabbed right outside of this door, for me, I think there are bigger questions like, you know, the focus on results, the focus on rules, like I think freedom of speech is an important component. Seah actually mentioned the lack of freedom of speech as a component, as a reason behind why we are not creative, right? So I think it's probably a long way before we get to that creative platform. And the survey that we saw earlier, I tend to agree with what the conference attendants are saying, really, that you know, probably will take another 10 years to get there. But yeah, I mean, that mindset change is probably the hardest.
Okay. They'll usually wait until you go to the car park before they nab you, from what I hear. Okay, I think we'll move on now to the questions that are getting the most votes on Pigeonhole. And as we can see, the one with 39 votes now is: how does the panel view startups contributing to the economy in the medium to long term? Now, perhaps I'll give Selena and Wai-Ho a chance to take a stab at this question. Obviously reflecting a little bit about the nature of our audience here as well. How do you see startups playing a bigger role in growing the economy? Selena, perhaps.
Well, I like to think of startups as two categories. I think if you think of the very glamorous tech startups that you see in Silicon Valley, I think those are nice to have, but very frankly, they're not going to be driving the bulk of the economy anytime in the near term. If you're talking about startups in the more local business space, it can be in all your traditional industries, then I think that's really where the potential come in. Because, I mean, you saw from the SBF survey, I mean, at the end of the day, SMEs drive 50% of the economy. They employ the bulk of the people. A lot of these enterprises have less than 10 people on their workforce. So it's really if people are empowered to say that, hey, I want to start a new business, it can be in a very old-fashioned business, hawker or otherwise, and they feel that there is opportunity to grow there, and they feel that there is money to be made there, then I think all and well, that's good. So I think that startups will be important, but very frankly, it's not the kind of glamorous tech startups that you're talking about.
Wai-Ho, would you agree?
I would chime in with a chorus of agreement, but I think it's important, but I think we must also be cognizant that we should do more to encourage this ecosystem. It has been a challenge for the longest time, given our limited resources as a small economy. But I think we've made strides in the recent past to create hubs for startups, and I think we've reached a point where it's starting to grow a little bit on its own without much help. But I think where we can do perhaps a bit more is to think in terms of your earlier question on FTAs. Have we included in sufficient terms in our FTAs, sufficient focus in our FTAs on perhaps expanding services space? Because I know that a lot of these startups are not necessarily manufacturers. Most of them tend to be services that manufacturers would require, provider of ancillary services. So perhaps if you were to retool the FTAs and review the FTAs, a more focused strategy in consultation with the business lobbies would be understanding what the needs of this generation of startups would be, and to perhaps maybe incorporate that in our dialogue, FTA dialogue with our trading partners.
Okay, I think that sees quite nicely into another one of these questions that has quite a lot of votes, and that's on the AEC. How important is the how important is the AEC going to be in terms of Singapore's economic growth for the next 5 years? Nizam, I noticed you want to make a comment. Is it related to this idea of FTAs?
Okay. Like I said, AEC is probably good to have, and probably a trophy for ASEAN after almost not doing anything over the last 30 years. So I think it is something to show for. But like I said, Singapore has, free trade agreement with almost everyone in ASEAN, so it's not really going to be that big. But I'm trying to link these three questions, regarding mindset, regarding startups and AEC. Probably it's time that, again, I have this tendency to blame the government, but it's probably time that the government should actually try to think of ways to boost our MNC's presence abroad. Just to give you one anecdote, right? When Malaysia wanted to have a casino way back in the 70s, Malaysia actually gave money to Lim Gotong to build road from KL to the top of the mountain, right? To build a resort there, and then you have Genting, right? And Genting eventually became a global player. Who doesn't know Genting? Now, you turn that to Singapore. Just a few years ago, it wasn't too long ago, Singapore decided to, after much browbeating, to have our own casino. And what do? We gave it to Sands and Genting, right? That was one example of allowing our local companies to make it big, first locally and then go globally. I think this example can be repeated in many other industries. I think that sort of mindset has to change. The mindset of quick solution, quick result through getting in the MNCs to do it and then will be successful, I think has to change. And AEC is the platform for that as well. I think we can start from local and then go to regional, within ASEAN and then globally.
Thanks. Being a bit mindful of time and potentially some of those who are not so comfortable with Pigeonhole, but potentially would anybody like to ask a question from any of the microphones that are spread out across the room? We will still take the traditional methods of asking questions. Anyone? Please. I think the nearest microphone should be there. If you could kindly introduce yourself as well.
My name is Tan Ki Hian. I guess we talked quite a bit about mindset and changes. And we have in this room some of the most illustrious business leaders of Singapore. So the question to the panel is, what is it that this group of people here can do to get us out of winter faster?
To get us out of the winter faster. Okay. It's quite a diverse group here, but would anybody like to take a stab at what we could do? Irving, I see you nodding your head at the end.
I love this question. Very good question. Now, all of you as business leader, do not underestimate the capability and the influence that you have. You are a business leader. What drives the country? Tell me. Some people say the government. No. It's not the government that deliver your GDP growth of XX% every year. It's all of you. You are the one, your company are the one that brings the GDP, creates the GDP, and distributes it across everyone's in Singapore. Businesses, let me emphasize again, and I can't help but keep emphasizing it. Businesses drive the economy. The government, at the end of the day, his role is just a facilitator. So in order to get everyone out of the winter, obviously, we require the concerted effort of everyone, which is why I say this initiative, for this position paper, is a very important first step. It's not just a voice, because it can eventually translate into real actions in terms of policy. Because why? What you are doing now is providing the feedback to the government, the facilitator. And then eventually, with some collaborations, we hope that will cascade into real policy that will benefit the businesses and indirectly benefit Singaporeans and the economy. Now that will get us through the winter.
Nizam, any thoughts on adding to that?
No, not really actually. I was just thinking it's funny because a lot of people think that economic forecasters are like weather forecasters. So,
Wai Ho, what's your weather forecast for the crowd that's been assembled in this room, and what can they do to change the weather?
It's an act of God, so it's not within my power to do that. But I would say this, I mean, it highlights the importance of business lobbies. And it's good to speak with one voice, but if you have differentiated voices, perhaps sometime in the future, differentiated lobbies also may speak up on concerns that are more specific to their particular industries.
Okay, and Selena, maybe your closing thoughts.
Okay. Actually, I think I'm not a businessman, I'm just an economist, but let me share my 5 cents worth. At the end of the day, if you are running a company or business, your thoughts are about survival. Okay, surviving the winter, surviving China. If it's about survival, you'll do whatever necessary, whatever it takes. Okay, the government can help, but at the end of the day, the government cannot run your business for you. Okay? So I agree. Government can be a facilitator. So if you do expand out of overseas, if it's for survival, you'll do it, no matter whatever the conditions are. So it's not a question of is the government there to support you or not. I mean, if you recognize that for whatever industry or business you're in, and the domestic market is going to see 2% growth in the foreseeable future, the market's very small, whether ASEAN is your backyard or not, whether it's China, whether it's Latin America, whether it's Africa, or US or Europe or wherever it may be, I mean, you should just go, I think the role of the government is really how to make sure you keep that linkage back to Singapore, and that the economic benefits of you having expanded overseas returns to Singapore. I think that's, at the end of the day, what is crucial to keeping the Singapore economy resilient and the ability to survive.
Thanks very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I think in a slightly compressed period of time, we've had the benefit of some insights and a look ahead as to what we can expect coming forward. But more importantly, some analysis and some recommendations as to what all of us can do throughout the economy to keep Singapore growing in the years ahead. I think that has value added on top of our original aim, which was looking purely at the economic outlook for 2016 and the years ahead. So please do join me in thanking our panelists for their views today. Thank you very much.